He told everyone she was dead, but I discovered a truth more horrifying than any nightmare could create. Good afternoon, my dears. I'm Zelda Harrington, 73 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story that changed my life forever. Before I begin, if you're watching this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps our community grow tremendously. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my stories reach so many different places. It was 1972, and I was just 20 years old. America was going through difficult times, but I was young and full of dreams. I worked as a nurse at Pinewood Memorial Hospital in a small town in Vermont. I wore that starched white uniform with the little cap that all nurses wore back then. My father had passed away recently, leaving only some debts and our modest house. My mother took in sewing work to supplement the little I earned at the hospital. It was on a rainy Tuesday that Thaddeus Mitchell walked into my life for the first time. He came to the hospital to visit a friend who had suffered a workplace accident. Tall, with graying hair at the temples, despite being only 30 years old, Thaddeus had a natural elegance that stood out among the simple men of our town. Everyone knew his story, the devoted widower who had lost his wife, Marigold, in a tragic car accident 5 years earlier. That day, he asked me for directions to his friend's room, and when he looked at me, I noticed something in his eyes. It wasn't just interest or admiration. It was as if he had found something he'd been searching for a long time. "You have kind eyes," he told me. "Rare these days." In the weeks that followed, Thaddeus appeared at the hospital even after his friend was discharged. He brought flowers, not for the patients, but for the reception desk, to brighten the environment, he said. But I knew it was a pretext to see me. A month later, he invited me for coffee after my shift. "You know, Zelda, since Marigold left us, I never thought I could feel again what I'm feeling," he confessed, as we sat in the only elegant cafe in town. "I'm afraid of these feelings, but I can't avoid them." Thaddeus owned a lumber mill that supplied major construction companies in Boston. He was respected in town, lived in a large house in the most affluent neighborhood, and drove a dark green Dodge Dart that made everyone turn their heads when it passed. For a simple girl like me, it seemed like a fairy tale. Our relationship progressed quickly. My mother warned me, "Be careful with widowers, Zelda. Some never really let their first wife go." But I was in love and wouldn't listen to advice. Thaddeus treated me like a princess. He took me to restaurants I could never afford to visit. He gave me French perfumes and talked about plans for the future. There was, however, one ritual that never changed. Every Saturday, precisely at 10 a.m., Thaddeus would go to the cemetery to bring red roses to Marigold's grave. "It's just respect," he explained. "I promised her I would never forget her." At first, I found it romantic. A man capable of honoring promises even after death. We married 6 months after meeting, in a simple ceremony at the local church. I moved into Thaddeus's large house with its heavy antique furniture, dark paintings, and an atmosphere that never seemed truly illuminated, even on the sunniest days. That's when I noticed the room. On the second floor, the last door in the hallway, there was a room that was always locked. When I asked about it, Thaddeus answered with practiced casualness, "It's just family mementos, old documents, nothing important, but I prefer to keep it locked so dust doesn't damage anything." I accepted the explanation. Who was I to question? I was living a life I never imagined possible. In the first few months, Thaddeus was the perfect husband, attentive, present, passionate, but his Saturday ritual never changed. Even on our first weekend as a married couple, at 10 a.m., there he was, leaving with his red roses. "Don't worry," I told myself. "With time, he'll move on. It's just gratitude." But time passed, and nothing changed. What began to intrigue me were the whispered comments that ceased when I entered a room. At church, at the market, even at the hospital where I continued working, I noticed pitying looks. Once, I clearly heard a woman tell her friend, "Poor thing, she'll never take Marigold's place." He'll never love anyone like he loved that woman. Thaddeus spoke little about his first wife. I knew only that they had met when they were young, that she was from a traditional family from Boston, and that the accident happened when she was returning alone from visiting her parents. The car went off the road at a curve. There wasn't much left, he would say, always stopping the phrase at that point, as if the pain were unbearable even after so many years. On our first wedding anniversary, Thaddeus gave me a pearl necklace. Marigold loved pearls, he commented, and immediately apologized when he saw my expression. It was the first time I felt I was living in the shadow of a ghost. As the months passed, I began to notice other disturbing details. Thaddeus had frequent nightmares. He would wake up sweating, murmuring Marigold's name, sometimes begging for forgiveness. When I asked, he said he couldn't remember anything. There were also the phone calls. Once a month, always on the first Monday, Thaddeus would receive a call that he answered in his study behind closed doors. When questioned, he said it was just lumber mill business, but I noticed how tense he became before these calls and how pensive he was afterward. It was in our second year of marriage that I became pregnant. I thought a child would change everything, that Thaddeus would finally leave the past behind. He seemed genuinely happy with the news, made plans for the baby's room, even started talking about hiring a nanny. But the cemetery visits not only continued, but intensified. Now he would sometimes go on Wednesdays, too. "I want to tell her about the baby," he explained when I asked. Marigold always wanted to be a mother. It was during this time that I began having strange dreams. I would see a woman with long, dark hair with her back to me, whispering words I couldn't understand. She never showed her face, but I somehow knew it was Marigold. One day, while organizing Thaddeus's closet, I found a small wooden box hidden beneath his shirts. Inside was a woman's wedding ring with an inscription, "Thaddeus and Marigold, eternally, 1962. I noticed there was no end date engraved, just a hyphen, as if the story continued. Thaddeus's behavior became more erratic as my pregnancy progressed. Sometimes I would catch him looking at my belly with an expression that wasn't joy, but something close to fear. On other occasions, he would lock himself in his study for hours, and I could hear him talking to himself. The neighbors, always willing to share gossip, began telling me stories about Marigold, that she was a beautiful woman, but nervous, that she had occasional crises, that Thaddeus had protected her from everything and everyone. A devoted man, like few others, they said. He took care of her until the end, even when it became difficult. What did "when it became difficult" mean? No one elaborated. They changed the subject when I asked. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement not to talk too much about Marigold around me. In my 7th month of pregnancy, I woke up in the middle of the night and Thaddeus wasn't in bed. I silently went downstairs and saw light under his study door. I didn't intend to spy, but I heard sobs. My husband was crying like a child, repeating Marigold's name like a litany. I returned to bed without making a sound, but I couldn't sleep. The next day, Thaddeus announced he would need to travel on business for 3 days. It's an important opportunity for the lumber mill. I can't refuse. It would be the first time I would be alone in that big, silent house since we got married. And that's when I made a decision that would change my life forever. I would discover what was in the locked room. As soon as Thaddeus left for his business trip that Friday, I felt the weight of silence fall over the house. During these 2 years of marriage, I had never been completely alone there. It was as if the walls kept secrets, as if the old portraits watched me, judging my presence in a place that never really seemed mine. I waited until nightfall. I remember it was raining heavily, one of those Vermont winter rains that seem endless. The tree branches scratched the windows like fingers trying to get in. With my 7 months of pregnancy, I slowly climbed the stairs, one hand on the railing, the other protecting my belly. The second-floor hallway seemed longer that night, the shadows denser, the air heavier. I stopped in front of the last door. How many times had I passed by there, imagining what might be stored on the other side? Thaddeus always carried the key with him, but I knew that somewhere there would be a copy. After all, old houses like that always had spare key sets. I spent the afternoon discreetly searching through kitchen drawers, the dining room sideboard, even the pockets of his coats in the closet. It was in the drawer of his bedside table that I found a small leather case. Inside were several old keys, some already rusted by time. I took the whole set and returned to the hallway. The third key I tried fit perfectly in the lock. I turned it slowly, feeling each movement of the internal mechanism. When I heard the click of the door unlocking, my heart raced. For a moment, I hesitated. There was something forbidden, something intimate about that act. I was invading not just a room, but Thaddeus's past, a past he had chosen to keep locked away from me. I pushed the door slowly, and the smell was the first thing I noticed. An odor of dried flowers, old perfume, and something more medicinal. I turned on the light and had to hold on to the doorknob to keep from falling. It wasn't a storage room for family mementos. It was a woman's bedroom preserved like a macabre museum. A perfectly made double bed with a white lace bedspread. A dressing table with perfume bottles, hairbrushes with dark strands still caught in them, jars of cream and makeup arranged as if their owner had just used them. On the walls, framed photographs of a younger Thaddeus alongside a woman of disturbing beauty, black hair down to her waist, large dark eyes, an enigmatic smile. Marigold. I finally saw the face that haunted my dreams. I opened the wardrobe and found dresses hanging in order of color, all in the style of the 1960s, all looking new. Shoes lined up underneath, purses, hats, gloves. It was as if she could return at any moment to get dressed. On the bedside table, a book with a bookmark still on page 47, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Next to it, a half-full glass of water. My God, was it possible that Thaddeus had kept even a glass of water all these years? That's when I noticed the desk in the corner of the room. On it was a brown leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first pages contained the elegant handwriting of a woman, entries dated 1961 and 1962, talking about the beginning of her relationship with Thaddeus, their marriage, plans for the future. There was happiness in those lines, but also something disturbing. References to bad days, darkness, and storms in the head. Starting in 1963, the handwriting changed. These were no longer Marigold's notes, but Thaddeus's. He had continued her diary as a one-sided conversation with his absent wife. The first entries spoke of longing, of pain from the loss. Then something strange began to emerge. Visited her today. The doctors say there's no improvement. I can't bear to see her like this, so different from my Marigold. But what could I do? The episodes were getting worse. She could have hurt someone, could have hurt herself. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right decision. But then I remember the fire, how I found her with the matches still in her hand, looking at the burning curtains as if they were the most beautiful thing in the world. I sat on the bed, unable to process what I was reading. The next entry was even more disturbing. Dr. Mendoza suggested more intensive treatments, electroshock, he calls it. He says it has good results in cases like hers, but how can I authorize something like that? She already seems so fragile, so lost, and yet what can I do? I have no choice. The diagnosis is clear. Paranoid schizophrenia, they said. My Marigold, my delicate flower, condemned to a fragmented spirit. I turned the pages, increasingly horrified. Thaddeus's entries detailed visits to a psychiatric institution, experimental treatments, the gradual deterioration of Marigold's mental health. And then, in 1967, the entry that changed everything. I did what needed to be done. Dr. Mendoza agreed it would be better for everyone. A car accident, we said, the body unrecognizable, immediate cremation at the family's request. Everyone believed it. It was necessary. People were already starting to ask questions, to speculate, and I could no longer bear the pitying looks, the questions about my wife's fragile health. Now, Marigold can rest in peace at Pinewood Psychiatric, away from curious eyes, receiving the treatment she needs. And I can just be the devoted widower, preserving her memory without the complications of the truth. It's better this way for everyone. Pinewood Psychiatric. The Pinewood Psychiatric Institute was 80 miles from our town, isolated in a rural area. It was a feared place, one of those old asylums where patients entered but rarely left. I continued reading, trembling more and more. The following entries detailed how Thaddeus had faked Marigold's death, how he had bribed doctors to falsify certificates, how he had spread the story of the tragic accident, all to hide the truth. His wife wasn't dead. She had been institutionalized in a psychiatric facility for 5 years when he met me. All this time, while he was courting me, while he was marrying me, while he was planting a new life in my womb, Marigold was alive, locked behind white walls, subjected to treatments that made my stomach turn just reading the descriptions. The weekly visits to the cemetery were just a facade. The grave was empty. The flowers never reached any decomposing body, because there was no body to honor. And the monthly phone calls, now it made sense. They were from Dr. Mendoza, updating Thaddeus on his special patient. The most recent entries showed a man divided between 2 lives. He spoke of me with genuine affection, of the hope the baby brought, but also of overwhelming guilt, of nightmares where Marigold accused him of betrayal, of abandonment. The last entry was from just 3 days ago. Dr. Mendoza called today. The new medication isn't working. Marigold had another violent episode. She attacked a nurse. They had to sedate her again. 15 years in that place and no real improvement. Sometimes I think about telling Zelda the truth. She has a good heart. Maybe she would understand. But how to explain such a lie? How to justify that I married her while my wife still lives? It's too late for truths. I will continue as always. I will visit the empty grave on Saturday. I will bring the red roses that Marigold loved so much, and then I will go to Pinewood to see her, even though she hasn't recognized me for years. It is my burden to carry my cross. I promised in sickness and in health, and I will fulfill it until the end, even if it means living this endless lie. I closed the diary and looked around the room once more. It wasn't a sanctuary of memories. It was a museum of lies, each preserved object, each smiling photograph, all part of an elaborate farce. I slid my hand over the lace bedspread, feeling the texture under my fingers. I opened the dresser drawers, finding delicate lingerie, love letters yellowed with time, jewelry boxes containing pearls, earrings, brooches, a woman's entire life frozen in time. I sat at the dressing table and looked at my reflection in the oval mirror. For a moment, I had the strange sensation that it wasn't my face I was seeing, but hers. I picked up one of the brushes, observing the long black strands still caught between the bristles. Hair from a woman everyone believed to be dead. Hair from a woman who at that very moment was breathing, existing, suffering. At the bottom of the desk drawer, I found more documents. The falsified death certificate, receipts for monthly payments to Pinewood Institute, always in cash, always substantial amounts, and a thin folder containing medical diagnoses, prescriptions, incident reports. The most recent folder contained a photograph. I barely recognized the woman from the other photos in the room. This Marigold was too thin, her face hollow, her eyes dull, her once luxuriant hair now thin and lifeless. The date in the corner of the photo, January 1972, just 2 months before I met Thaddeus. I carefully put everything back in its place. I locked the door as I left. I returned to our bedroom, no, Thaddeus's and my room, never really ours, and lay on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, one hand on my belly where our daughter moved, oblivious to the nightmare I had just discovered. What would I do with such knowledge? Confront Thaddeus? Report him to the authorities? Pretend I never discovered the truth? My head spun with possibilities, none without devastating consequences. One thing I knew for certain. On Saturday, Thaddeus would not go to the cemetery alone. I would follow him and then follow him to Pinewood Institute. I needed to see with my own eyes. I needed to meet the woman who was technically still the legitimate wife of the man I had married. The woman whose place I had unknowingly usurped. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. The image of Marigold, the real one, the living one, the prisoner, wouldn't leave my mind. And for the first time since I met Thaddeus, I felt real fear of the man who slept beside me every night, of the man who was capable of burying a living wife in oblivion and building a new life on this foundation of lies. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The truth weighed on me like a tombstone. Ironically, a tombstone more real than the one Thaddeus had faithfully visited for years. When morning came, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, trying to appear normal to Mrs. Peterson, our housekeeper who came 3 times a week. She noticed my paleness. "You don't look well, ma'am. Is the baby giving you trouble?" she asked, placing another cup of coffee in front of me. "I just didn't sleep well, Mrs. Peterson. Dr. Oliver said it's normal during pregnancy." How could I explain that I had discovered my marriage was a sham? That my husband kept his supposedly dead first wife locked in an asylum while making me believe he was a devoted widower? There were no words for such a revelation. Thaddeus called that morning as promised. His voice sounded normal, affectionate, even asking about my well-being, about the baby, saying he would return Sunday night. I heard myself responding naturally, as if nothing had changed. "We're fine, dear. Rest and have a good trip back." Who was this calm woman speaking with the voice that came from my throat? Saturday dawned clear, one of those winter days when the sun shines but doesn't warm. Thaddeus always said sunny Saturdays were gifts from Marigold, an irony that I now understood in all its perversity. I dressed carefully. A discreet brown dress, a beige coat, a scarf to cover my hair, clothes to not draw attention. Mrs. Peterson wouldn't come that day, which made my plans easier. I took some money I kept for emergencies and my documents. I thought about taking Thaddeus's diary as proof, but decided not to touch anything that might alert him. At 9:30, I left the house and walked to the nearest taxi stand. I gave an address 3 blocks from the cemetery. I didn't want the driver to know exactly where I was going. I arrived at the cemetery at 9:50. Thaddeus was as punctual as a Swiss watch. He would be there at 10 sharp. I hid behind a marble mausoleum that offered a good view of Marigold's grave. I didn't have to wait long. Soon the dark green Dodge Dart parked at the main gate. Thaddeus got out carrying the usual bouquet of red roses. He wore his gray suit, reserved for formal occasions and cemetery visits. I watched him walk among the tombstones, stop before Marigold's false grave, place the flowers, make the sign of the cross. He stayed there for almost 10 minutes, his lips moving in silent prayers. Prayers for a woman who wasn't there, who had never been there. A perfect performance for a non-existent audience, except today, there was a spectator. When he walked away, I waited until the car disappeared around the bend. I ran to the street and was lucky to find a passing taxi. "Follow that green Dodge, please," I asked the driver, who looked at me curiously. "It's my husband. I'm preparing a surprise for our anniversary and need to know where he's going to buy my present," I lied, with an ease that scared me. The driver smiled, complicit in what he believed to be an innocent game between husband and wife. If he knew the true nature of the game unfolding. Thaddeus didn't head for home or downtown. He took the state highway, heading west. We followed at a safe distance, my heart beating harder as the miles passed. After almost an hour, the Dodge turned onto a secondary dirt road. A faded sign indicated, "Pinewood Psychiatric Institute, 3 miles. I asked the driver to stop. "I think I've discovered the surprise," I smiled tensely. "Can you wait for me here? I'll pay double the fare." He agreed, turning on the radio and leaning back in his seat. I got out and followed the dirt road on foot, keeping to the edge where trees offered some protection from the road. The pregnancy made walking more difficult, but adrenaline propelled me forward. After about 15 minutes, I spotted the Institute's gates. It was a complex of old buildings, colonial in style, surrounded by high walls with barbed wire on top. It looked more like a prison than a hospital. I saw Thaddeus's car parked with a few other vehicles near the main entrance. How to enter without being seen? I circled the wall until I found a part less visible from the main buildings. There, the vegetation grew taller next to the wall. There was a tree whose branches extended inside the property. Under other circumstances, I would never have tried to climb a tree being 7 months pregnant. But nothing about this situation was normal. Carefully, I climbed the lower branches, ignoring the scratches on my arms and the dress tearing in places. Upon reaching a branch that projected over the wall, I stopped to catch my breath. From there I had a partial view of an inner courtyard where some patients, or were they prisoners, walked slowly, some alone, others supported by nurses in white uniforms. I descended the other side with even more care, grateful for the relatively low height of the wall at that point. My feet touched the soil of Pinewood Institute, and a chill ran down my spine. I was inside. I kept close to the walls, avoiding open areas. The complex was larger than it seemed, with several interconnected buildings. Through the windows, I could see long corridors, closed doors, occasionally a nurse or doctor passing by hurriedly. The smell was what impressed me most, a mixture of disinfectant, institutional food, and something else, something I can only describe as despair. In a more remote area, I spotted a smaller building, separate from the others. It had only one entrance guarded by a man in a gray uniform. As I watched, I saw Thaddeus approach, greet the guard with familiarity, and enter. How could I approach that building without being detected? The answer came in the form of a young nurse who was leaving one of the main buildings carrying a pile of towels. Without thinking twice, I approached her from behind a bush. "I need your help," I whispered, making her start. Before she could scream, I continued quickly. "I'm pregnant, as you can see. My husband brought my sister here 15 years ago. They told me she died, but I discovered the truth. Please, I just want to see her." The nurse, who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, looked at me with wide eyes. "Ma'am, I can't. I'll lose my job." "Please," I insisted, placing my hand on my belly. "I'm doing this for my daughter, who has the right to know her aunt. I won't cause any problems. I just need to see her once." Something in my desperation must have touched the young woman. She hesitated, then sighed. "Who is your sister?" "Marigold. Marigold Mitchell." Her eyes widened even more. "The special patient, the one in Pavilion C." She looked around nervously. "No one can enter there without Dr. Mendoza's authorization, not even us regular nurses." "Please," I repeated, "I just need to see her for a moment." After a long hesitation, the nurse nodded. "Come with me, but if we're caught, I'll deny I helped you." She led me along a path between bushes to the back of Pavilion C. There was a service door used for supply deliveries. "I can only let you in. I can't accompany you. Mr. Mitchell usually stays for an hour." "You have until then." With trembling hands, she unlocked the door. "Third room on the right in the hallway. There's a small window in the door. You can look through there, but do not enter the room for God's sake." I thanked her and entered. The hallway was poorly lit, with yellowish lamps that occasionally flickered. The smell of medications was stronger here, mixed with something I recognized from my days at the hospital. The odor of human bodies kept in confinement for a long time. I walked silently to the third room. The small window in the door was covered from the inside with a thin fabric, but I could distinguish shapes through it. I brought my eye to the opening. What I saw will be forever etched in my memory. The room was small, with padded walls. A narrow bed was fixed to the floor, and on it, sitting with her back against the wall, was a woman. She was no longer the beauty from the photographs. Her body was skeletal, her once luxuriant hair cut irregularly very short. She wore a hospital gown, faded from countless washings. But what impressed me most were her eyes. Large, dark, completely empty of expression. She stared fixedly ahead, without blinking, without reacting to Thaddeus's presence, who was sitting in a chair by the bed. He held her hand, speaking softly. I couldn't hear the words, but his face showed a mixture of pain, guilt, and love. Yes, even after all these years, even after all the suffering he had caused, there was love in that look. Suddenly, Marigold turned her head. For a terrible moment, I thought she had seen me, but no. She had just changed position, still showing no recognition of Thaddeus's presence. He continued talking, now caressing her hair. At one point, he took something small from his pocket. It seemed to be a lipstick. Carefully, he applied it to her dry lips. The gesture broke me inside. It was so intimate, so loaded with shared history. There was a man who kept his wife prisoner, who had declared her dead to the world, who had built a new life on lies, and yet still loved her in his own distorted way. As I watched, Marigold had a sudden change. Her body stiffened, her eyes widened, and she began to tremble. Thaddeus quickly pressed a button on the wall. Seconds later, 2 burly orderlies rushed in. One held Marigold, while the other administered an injection into her arm. I backed away, fearing discovery. Through the small window, I saw Marigold gradually relax, her eyes closing as the medication took effect. Thaddeus remained for a few more minutes, then kissed her forehead and left, while the orderlies adjusted her on the bed. I hid in a supply closet when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Thaddeus passed by, accompanied by a man in a white coat, presumably Dr. Mendoza. Their voices came in fragments. No significant improvement, more aggressive treatments, how much longer? Quality of life, your responsibility, difficult decisions. When the footsteps receded, I left the closet and quickly returned to the back door. The young nurse was anxiously waiting. "Did you see her?" she asked in whispers. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat was constricted with emotion. It's sad, isn't it? 15 years here and only getting worse. Mr. Mitchell is the only visitor she has. He comes faithfully every week, since I arrived 2 years ago. They say he's never missed a visit in all these years. What exactly does she have? I managed to ask. Severe schizophrenia from what I've heard, resistant to treatments. At the beginning, she still talked, had moments of lucidity. Now, she shook her head sadly. The electroshocks and new medications left her like this. A ghost. A ghost. That was exactly it. Marigold was a ghost, not because she was dead, as Thaddeus had made the world believe, but because what remained of her was just a shadow of the woman she had been. I thanked the nurse and made my way back. I climbed the wall again, with even more difficulty this time, my body heavy with the baby and with the revelations of that day. The taxi driver was still waiting, listening to a football game on the radio. "Found what you were looking for, ma'am?" he asked casually as I got into the car. What a question to ask. I had found much more than I was looking for. I had found the truth, and it was more painful than any lie I could have imagined. "Yes," I replied simply. "Take me back to town, please." During the entire journey, I remained silent, looking out the window without really seeing the landscape. My mind was occupied with what I had witnessed, with impossible decisions, with the weight of knowledge. Thaddeus hadn't killed Marigold. In some ways, what he had done was worse. He had kept her in limbo, preserved like a relic, visited as a sacred obligation while building a parallel life with me, with our baby on the way. It was monstrous, and at the same time, there was something deeply tragic in it all. When the taxi dropped me off near our house, no, Thaddeus's house, never really mine, I had already made my decision. I couldn't continue living that lie. I couldn't pretend I didn't know. I couldn't allow my daughter to be born and grow up on a foundation of falsehoods. I entered the house, went directly to our bedroom, and began packing a suitcase with my essential things: clothes, documents, what little money I had. I could go to my mother's house temporarily while deciding the next steps. But then, looking at the bed I shared with Thaddeus, at the furniture we had chosen together, at the crib already assembled in the room next door waiting for our daughter, something inside me changed. A cold anger began to replace the initial shock. Why should I be the one to leave? Why should I give up everything when I was the victim in this whole story? Thaddeus was the liar, the manipulator. It was he who should face the consequences of his actions. I put the suitcase at the bottom of the closet and sat on the edge of the bed. I would wait for him, confront the truth face to face, and then I would do what needed to be done. Thaddeus arrived Sunday night, as promised. I heard the Dodge Dart engine turning off in the garage, the familiar footsteps in the entrance hall, the tinkling of keys being placed on the small hallway table. Sitting in the living room armchair in the dark, I waited as he called my name. "Zelda, I'm home, dear." "Where are you?" I turned on the lamp beside me. The dim light illuminated my face, leaving the rest of the room in shadows. Thaddeus stopped at the door, surprised to find me like this, sitting in the dark. "What's wrong? Are you feeling well?" There was genuine concern in his voice. How did he manage it? How could he sound so sincere while living such an elaborate lie? "The grave is empty, Thaddeus." 5 words, 5 simple words that changed everything. I saw the blood drain from his face, his eyes widen in shock, then narrow in understanding. I didn't need to say anything else. He knew exactly what I meant. "Zelda, I can explain." His voice trembled slightly, his hands moving in nervous gestures. "Explain what? That your wife isn't dead? That you've kept her locked in an asylum for 15 years? That our entire life together is built on a lie?" He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing a physical blow. When he reopened them, there was a mixture of resignation and relief in his gaze, the relief of someone who has carried a heavy secret for so long and is finally discovered. "How? How did you find out?" he asked, collapsing onto the sofa in front of my armchair. "The locked room, your diary. And yesterday I followed you to the Institute." Thaddeus covered his face with his hands. We sat in silence for a long minute. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded tired, defeated. "You don't understand, Zelda. No one understands. Marigold she was everything to me. We met so young. We had so many dreams, but then it started. First, it was small things. She would forget where she left objects. She had abrupt mood changes. I thought it was just nervousness. Her father was strict, demanding. She always wanted to please him. He stood up, walked to the bar, and poured himself a whiskey. He didn't offer me one. He knew I didn't drink, especially during pregnancy. Small details of intimacy that made everything even more painful. The episodes got worse. She began having delusions. She thought people were persecuting her, that they wanted to take her away from me. There were days when she didn't recognize me, called me by other names. We consulted doctors in Boston, then in New York. They all said the same thing, schizophrenia. There was no cure, only management of symptoms. He took a long sip of his drink, his hands still trembling slightly. We tried all available treatments, experimental medications, therapies, even treatments abroad. Nothing worked for long, and then came the fire. I already knew this part from the diary, but I let him continue. I needed to hear it from him in his own words. It was our wedding anniversary, 7 years. I prepared a special dinner, bought a gift. She seemed well that week. The new medicines were working. But when I got home, his voice faltered. She had set our bedroom on fire. She was sitting on the bed, watching the flames consume the curtains, the carpet. She was smiling like a child watching fireworks. If I had arrived 10 minutes later, he drank the rest of the whiskey in one gulp. That's when I realized I couldn't take care of her at home anymore. It was dangerous for her, for me, for the neighbors. Dr. Mendoza recommended admission to Pinewood. It is the best institute in the state. I thought it would be temporary, weeks, maybe months. Thaddeus sat down again, now leaning forward, elbows on his knees, the empty glass hanging between his fingers. But the months turned into years. She wasn't getting better. The new treatments left her doped, absent. When we reduced the doses, the violent episodes returned. People in town started asking, whispering, "Where is Marigold? Why do we never see her? What is Thaddeus hiding?" He raised his eyes to me, silently begging for understanding. It was Dr. Mendoza who suggested it. He said it would be easier for everyone if Marigold simply disappeared. Officially, I mean. An accident, a tragic death. He had contacts, could arrange the necessary documents. I would become the respectable widower, no longer the husband of the crazy woman. And Marigold could receive treatment in peace, without social pressure, without looks of pity or fear. "So you killed her," I said, my voice strangely calm. "Not physically, but socially. You erased her from the world." "I protected her." His voice rose for the first time. "You don't know what it was like, Zelda. The looks, the whispers when we passed, how people moved away from her at social gatherings, fearing an episode. How our house became a prison because she could no longer go out without supervision. And now her prison is real," I retorted. 15 years locked in that horrible place, Thaddeus. 15 years. "And you? You moved on, met me, married me, got me pregnant, all while she withered between four walls." "I never abandoned her," he said, his voice now almost a whisper. "Not a single Saturday, not a week without visiting her, talking to her, even though she hasn't recognized me for years. And the grave, the cemetery visits?" "Appearances," he admitted, lowering his gaze. "So no one would suspect, to keep the story alive. And also a form of mourning, because the Marigold I knew and loved really did die, Zelda. What remains at the Institute is just a shadow." We fell silent again. Outside, the wind began to blow harder, announcing a storm. It seemed appropriate. "What do you intend to do now?" he finally asked. It was the question I had been asking myself since I discovered the truth. What to do with such knowledge? What to do with the shattered remains of what I believed was my life? "I'm going to report you, Thaddeus, to the police, to the medical authorities. What you did is a crime, document forgery, fraud, maybe even false imprisonment." He nodded slowly, as if already expecting this. "They'll put her in a public institution, you know. Pinewood is expensive, but it's the best place for her. Government hospitals are overcrowded, with few doctors, outdated treatments." "Are you trying to manipulate me? Make me feel guilty for wanting justice?" "I'm just stating facts, Zelda. You're a nurse. You know the reality of our public hospitals. Think about what would be best for Marigold. Don't you dare." I stood up, anger finally breaking through my facade of calm. "Don't you dare use your love for her as justification. If you really loved her, you wouldn't have built another family while she still breathes." I saw something change in his eyes then. A hardening, a dangerous gleam I had never noticed before. "And our baby, Zelda? Have you thought about what will happen when this story comes out? The scandal? How our daughter will grow up knowing her father is a criminal? How will you support a child alone without my financial support?" It was so predictable. The resort to emotional blackmail, practical concerns, guilt. Typical of someone accustomed to manipulating, to controlling narratives. "I'd rather raise my daughter alone in poverty than in a house built on lies," I responded firmly. "I'd rather she know her mother had the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it was." I walked to the phone on the side table. "I'm going to call the police now." I didn't expect what happened next. Thaddeus moved with surprising speed for a man his age. Before I could reach the phone, he grabbed my arm, pulling me away. "You can't do this, Zelda. I won't allow it." I tried to break free, but his grip was too firm. For the first time since I'd known him, I felt physical fear of him. "Let me go, Thaddeus. You're hurting my arm." "Listen." His voice was different now, a tone I had never heard before. "We can resolve this just between us. No one needs to know. I can explain everything, make you understand. We have a life together, a baby on the way. Let me go." I struggled harder, panic growing. At that moment, the man in front of me was a stranger, not the gentle, attentive Thaddeus I had known. This was someone capable of elaborate lies, of manipulation, perhaps even of, "I won't let you destroy everything I've built, everything I've sacrificed." His voice rose, his face contorted into a mask of anger and desperation. I managed to break free with a violent pull, but in doing so, I lost my balance. I felt my body fall backward, my arms flailing for support they didn't find. My head hit the corner of the coffee table with a horrible, hollow sound. The pain was immediate, overwhelming. I felt a warm liquid running down my scalp. My vision darkened at the edges. The last thing I saw was Thaddeus's face, transformed by horror as he realized what had just happened. Then, darkness. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room. The white, sterile light, the constant beeping of monitors, the smell of disinfectant, all familiar to me who had worked in that environment for so long. But now I was on the other side, a patient. I tried to move, and a sharp pain in my head made me groan. Immediately, a nurse appeared at my side. "Stay still, Mrs. Mitchell. You've suffered a serious head trauma." "My baby," was the first thing I could say. My hand instinctively seeking my belly, but something was wrong. It was smaller, flabbier. The nurse's face contracted in compassion. She didn't need to say anything. I understood immediately. "I'm sorry," she said anyway. "We did everything we could, but the fall, the trauma." I closed my eyes, tears silently flowing. My daughter, my little one who would never get to know the world, another victim of Thaddeus's lies. "Where is my husband?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The nurse hesitated. "Mr. Mitchell is at the police station, ma'am. He's been detained." Detained? Then someone else knew. Someone besides me knew the truth. "It was he himself who called the ambulance," continued the nurse. "He was in a panic when we arrived. He confessed everything to the doctor on duty, about the argument, the fall, and also about the first wife. So that was it. The castle of lies was finally crumbling. In a way, there was poetic justice in it all. The truth I had discovered and planned to reveal came to light anyway, through Thaddeus's own desperate actions. "The police want to speak with you as soon as you're able," the nurse informed me. "But don't worry about that now. You need to rest and recover." Recover? How could I recover from such loss, from such deception? From the death of my daughter who never got to breathe? In the days that followed, I learned the details through the police officers who came to take my statement. Thaddeus had confessed everything: Marigold's fake death, the forged documents, the agreement with Dr. Mendoza, and also how he had tried to prevent me from reporting him, how he had lost control, how my fall had been accidental, but a direct result of his actions. Dr. Mendoza had also been arrested. Pinewood Institute underwent a complete investigation, revealing deplorable conditions and questionable treatments in several wards. Marigold, along with other patients, was transferred to a university hospital in Boston, where she would receive more humane and appropriate treatment. As for me, after 2 weeks in the hospital, I received a physical discharge, but not an emotional one. I returned to my mother's house, carrying not only the scar on my head, but much deeper wounds in my soul. The case made the newspapers, of course. "Businessman keeps dead wife in asylum for 15 years, the headline said. The whole town talked about it. I, who had once been envied for having won the coveted widower, was now the object of pity and malicious gossip. She didn't know. How didn't she notice? There must have been signs. Thaddeus's trial took place 6 months later. The courtroom was packed every day, not just with journalists and curious onlookers, but with people who knew our story, who had believed in the devoted widower's farce as much as I had. I saw familiar faces in the rows, neighbors, colleagues from the hospital, even Mrs. Peterson, our former housekeeper, who cried silently in a corner. I sat in the front row beside my mother. I had lost so much weight that my old dresses seemed to belong to another woman. In a way, it was true. The confident, love-struck Zelda had died along with my daughter on that fateful night. Thaddeus seemed equally transformed. The elegant, controlled man I knew was now haggard, with deep circles under his eyes and hair that had turned almost completely white in the few months of preventive detention. Our gazes met only once during the entire process. I saw in him a mixture of remorse, shame, and something else: relief. The relief of someone who can finally stop pretending. 15 years of deliberate fraud, thundered the prosecutor in his final accusation. 15 years keeping a vulnerable woman isolated from society under false pretenses. And when the truth threatened to come out, the defendant reacted with violence, causing not only serious injuries to his second wife, but also the death of the baby she was carrying. Thaddeus's lawyer tried to build a defense based on my ex-husband's dedication. My client never abandoned his first wife. He faithfully visited her for 15 years, ensuring she received the best available treatment. His actions, though technically illegal, were motivated by genuine love and concern. Love. How that word could be distorted, stretched until it completely lost its original meaning. What kind of love locks a person away from the world, denies their existence, builds a parallel life on their forced absence? Dr. Mendoza, in exchange for a reduced sentence, testified against Thaddeus, revealing sordid details of the agreement they had maintained for years. Mr. Mitchell paid 3 times the normal rate for Mrs. Marigold's hospitalization, he explained to the court. In return, we guaranteed absolute discretion and exclusive treatments. When conventional medications stopped working, we resorted to more intensive therapies. The word intensive hung in the air like a miasma. Everyone knew what it meant: electroshock, physical restraint, experimental drugs, treatments that, as I later discovered through the seized medical records, had significantly contributed to Marigold's mental deterioration. During the trial, a forensic psychiatrist presented his report on Marigold's current state. The patient suffers from severe schizophrenia, aggravated by years of institutionalization and inadequate treatments. Her current condition is irreversible. She lives in an almost catatonic state with brief periods of extreme agitation. She does not recognize family members or caregivers, cannot perform basic tasks without assistance, and her verbal communication is practically non-existent. The sentence came after 2 weeks of testimonies: 12 years in prison for Thaddeus for document forgery, fraud, conspiracy, and involuntary manslaughter of our unborn daughter. Dr. Mendoza received 8 years. Pinewood Institute was permanently closed, its patients transferred to other institutions. When the judge announced the sentence, I didn't feel the satisfaction I had expected, just an immense emptiness and the certainty that real, true justice was impossible in that situation. What could 12 years in prison repair? Could they give back the 15 years Marigold had lost? Could they bring back my daughter? Could they heal the invisible scars we all carried? After the trial, I returned to my mother's house. I tried to resume my work at the hospital, but the looks, the whispers, the veiled questions made the environment unbearable. I requested a transfer to another hospital, in another city, but the notoriety of the case followed me. I was the second wife, the deceived nurse, the woman who lost everything. Labels that defined me in the eyes of others, erasing who I really was. It was during this dark period that I made a decision that would change my life. If I couldn't escape the story, I would use the story, use my experience, my pain, to try to prevent other Marigolds from being forgotten, other Thaddeus's from manipulating the system, other Zeldas from living in castles of lies. In 1974, a year after the trial, I enrolled in the psychology program at university. At 22, I was older than most freshmen and carried experiences none of them could imagine. I studied during the day and worked as a nurse at night to pay tuition. I slept little, ate poorly, but for the first time since the tragedy, I felt I was moving in some direction, not just existing in a limbo of pain. During the course, I specialized in mental health, focusing on humanized treatments for patients with schizophrenia and other psychoses. My professors noticed my almost obsessive dedication to the subject. How could I explain to them that each article I read, each technique I learned, each case I studied, was filtered through a silent question. What if Marigold had received this treatment? What if she had had this opportunity? In 1978, graduated and with ongoing specialization, I secured an internship at Brighton Psychiatric Hospital in Boston, the same institution where Marigold had been transferred after Pinewood's closure. It wasn't a coincidence. I had specifically requested that placement. My first day there was surreal. I walked the same corridors that Marigold walked daily. I breathed the same air, heard the same sounds. The difference was that I could leave at the end of the day. She couldn't. Marigold was in the intensive care ward, reserved for patients in more serious condition. It wasn't my area of work, but I got permission to visit her occasionally as part of my academic research. On my first visit, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The Marigold from the photographs in the locked room, beautiful, vivid, with bright eyes, had completely disappeared. In her place was a woman of indefinite age, thin and white hair, skeletal body, vacant gaze fixed on some point beyond the room's walls. Sitting in a wheelchair by the window, she didn't react when I approached, when I spoke her name, when I gently touched her hand. "She's like this most of the time," explained the nurse who accompanied me. "Rarely speaks, almost never responds to stimuli. Feeding through a nasal tube 3 times a day, bath with complete assistance. The doctors say it's the result of years of electroshocks and neuroleptics in excessive doses." I stared at that destroyed woman and felt something beyond compassion, beyond the guilt I carried for having inadvertently been part of her tragic story. I felt a deep responsibility. If I couldn't save her, and the doctors were unanimous that her state was irreversible, I could at least ensure that her final years were dignified. And more importantly, I could work to ensure that other people in similar situations had different fates. In 1980, while Thaddeus was serving his 8th year in prison, I completed my doctorate with a thesis on humanizing mental health treatment, new approaches for patients with schizophrenia. The work, partially based on my experience with Marigold, gained national recognition and was published as a book the following year. With the visibility the book brought, I secured funding to create a center for innovative studies and practices in mental health within Brighton Hospital. It was an experimental space where we tested less invasive approaches, more focused on the individual and not just the disease, expressive therapies, more balanced pharmacological treatments, less institutional environments. Marigold didn't directly benefit from these innovations. Her condition was too compromised for any significant intervention, but she became, without knowing it, the inspiration for changes that helped hundreds of other patients. In a sense, her personal tragedy transformed into collective redemption. In 1982, I received news that Thaddeus had obtained parole for good behavior. I didn't see him personally, but I learned through mutual acquaintances that he was unrecognizable, a prematurely aged man, a shadow of the respected businessman he had been. He moved to another state, started over as an employee in a small furniture company, living modestly and avoiding social contacts. We never met again. What could we say to each other after all? What words would be enough to bridge the abyss between us? I let him go, not out of forgiveness. I never could completely forgive him, but out of the necessity to move forward. Anger, I discovered, is too heavy a burden to carry for an entire lifetime. Marigold died in 1985, at the age of 45, a victim of pneumonia aggravated by her debilitated state. It was I who arranged her funeral, a real one this time, not the farce orchestrated by Thaddeus years before. It was a simple service, with few present, some hospital professionals, my mother, 2 old friends of Marigold's that I managed to locate. Thaddeus didn't attend, although I made sure he was informed. On the tombstone, different from that empty one I discovered years before, I had engraved, "Marigold Mitchell, 1940-1985. Her story will not be forgotten." Because this was my commitment, to ensure that her life and death had not been in vain. The center I founded grew, becoming a national reference in humanized treatments for severe mental disorders. In 1987, we expanded to our own building and renamed it the Marigold Mitchell Institute for Humanized Mental Health. It was my way of honoring her, of transforming her name, previously associated only with tragedy and scandal, into a symbol of hope and dignity. The American psychiatric reform, which gained strength in the 1990s, found in our institute a practical model of what it theoretically advocated: deinstitutionalization, community treatments, respect for patient autonomy. I actively participated in this movement, bringing Marigold's story, always with due ethical care, as an example of what should no longer happen in our country. I never married again, not from trauma or fear, but because my life took such an intense, focused turn that romantic relationships seemed secondary. I had brief relationships over the years, some significant, but none that made me deviate from the path I had chosen. I also never had other children. The loss of my daughter left a scar that time softened but never completely erased. Instead, I channeled my maternal instinct toward my patients, my students when I began teaching at the university, and later toward my nephews, children of my younger brother. Today, at 73, I look back and see a life built on the rubble of a tragedy. A life I didn't plan but found amid the pain. A life dedicated to ensuring that other Marigolds have voices, that other Thaddeus's find help before desperation leads them to terrible choices, that other Zeldas don't live in castles of lies. The grave that Thaddeus faithfully visited every Saturday was empty, but in it, ironically, I buried my pain, my resentment, my old identity, and from it, like an unlikely phoenix, I rose transformed. When young mental health professionals ask me how I managed it, how I transformed such personal tragedy into positive work, I answer with the simple truth I learned. Sometimes we need to dig empty graves to find true life. Sometimes we need to descend to the depths of pain to find purpose. Sometimes the greatest lies can, paradoxically, lead us to the most important truths. Every Saturday, I still visit Marigold's grave. I don't bring red roses as Thaddeus did in his macabre charade, but sunflowers, symbols of light, of life that persistently turns toward the sun, even on the darkest days. And as I place the flowers on the real tombstone, I silently thank the woman I never truly knew, but who, through her forced absence, her undeserved suffering, showed me my path. This is my story, a story of deception, of pain, of loss, but also a story of rebirth, of purpose found in the ashes of destruction. If it touches your heart, if it makes you look with more humanity at those suffering from mental disorders, if it inspires even a small positive change in your life or someone close to you, then the empty grave I dug so many years ago will have finally fulfilled its deepest purpose, bringing life where there was only disguised death. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.